Okay, good morning, everyone. So I'm Chi Zhang. I'm the lecturer of the Glasgow Law School. So welcome to our Glasgow Forum on Climate Finance and Rule of Law. So in our today's the seminar is around 1 hour. So we will discuss the legal issues of the green finance and climate finance, particularly with the 4 speakers will focus on the legal matters of the green finance and climate finance in developing countries. So in our session, we very glad to invite the Associate Professor Fenghua Li from the University of International Business and Economics from China, and also the Dr. Meihui Zhang from Nankai University School of Finance, and also Dr. Ziyu Liu from the University of Hong Kong. Okay, so at the beginning, we would like to invite Dr. Ziyu Liu to give her speech around the green infrastructure of climate finance in developing countries.
Okay. Thanks for Chi's invitation. It's my great honor to present my opinions at this roundtable today. The topic of my presentation is challenges and the possibilities. So maybe the next page of my slide. Challenges and possibilities of green infrastructure in developing countries, which is divided into 3 main parts. Maybe the next page. First is to point out existing challenges of green infrastructure in developing countries compared with developed countries. Second is to put forward some feasible suggestions for developing and improving green infrastructure in developing areas and countries, which could make green infrastructure possible and feasible in these areas. Third is to analyze current developments or policies for green infrastructure in developing countries, especially applying some approaches of green investments and carbon finance. So in terms of existing difficulties of green infrastructure in developing countries, first is that compared with developed countries, there is a huge gap in the existing infrastructure situations and facilities in developing countries. For example, in the field of road construction, the average level of European developed countries is about 120 kilometers of new paved roads per 100 square kilometers, while in Asia, the figure is 20 kilometers. What is even worse, in Latin America and Africa, this number is much smaller, fewer than 5 kilometers. In terms of energy usage, less than half of the population in Southeast Asia, South Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa can also use a clean fuel for cooking and pipeline water. This could show that the energy usage in some developing countries even cannot meet the most basic needs of the majority of people for their survival and daily life. Against this background, it is quite difficult for these developing countries to update their infrastructure facilities. It could be found that the huge infrastructure gap compared with those in developed countries make green infrastructure development harder, as that even if sustainable infrastructure is already built under great governmental support, it still lacks sufficient supporting facilities to maximize its value and practical application. Next page, thanks. The second challenge is that green infrastructure in developing countries lack resources and have financial difficulties in these developing countries. Actually, it is well recognized that the infrastructure, construction, and development has a huge demand of capital and fund, which might also bring about some common problems such as low government efficiency, weak institutions, and political corruption. Private capital investment in infrastructure construction also has many problems. Countries and fields driven by economic interest can attract a lot of investment, while other regions and fields with equal or even greater demand are not favored by capital and the fund. For example, the transportation and new energy fields have rapid returns, are much easier to obtain investment and funds such as private investment and fund. However, certain infrastructure projects such as the construction of seawalls or environmental protection projects for climate change, which are usually unprofitable, are not favored by investors. Among developing countries, it is the emerging markets that are funded by the majority of investments, while the real poorest areas and countries are less cared by capital and investment. From 2011 to 2015, only 24 of the 56 projects involving private capital. Among them, there are also great differences between regions. For example, Laos alone accounts for more than 30% of private capital and investment in the poorest countries. According to the Financing for Sustainable Development Report 2020, more sustainable infrastructure requires high investment and slow returns, which make developing countries that pursue rapid and large-scale construction to cope with environmental challenges. Next page. The third challenge is that green infrastructure in developing countries lack political incentives and courage. Many developing countries do not have comprehensive development plan for political officials in order to achieve a rapid return on performance. The development of long-term and sustainable infrastructure is not a politically pleasing and popular option for them. Also, leaders often lack long-term vision due to factors such as tenure and election campaigns, and cannot integrate infrastructure as part of the whole country's long-term development. These challenges make developing countries impossible or hard to green infrastructure and affect the practical application of green infrastructure. Therefore, it could be that countries do not have enough wealth and facilities to further develop the green infrastructure, as they lack resources and funds to promote green infrastructure. Furthermore, private investment and fund externally are also lack strong economic incentives to enter in these constructions and promotions of green infrastructure. So in this case, in order to address these challenges, a sustainable financial framework maybe the next page, a sustainable financial framework that systematically reduce risk and increase resilience is suggested to be established. For financial institutions, next page, okay. For financial institutions, it is necessary for them to establish a framework to examine systematic risk and improve their own response capabilities. For example, Japan's agenda framework for disaster risk reduction emphasized that in addition to consider natural disaster, it also covers other man-made, technological, environmental, and biological disease. It gives a good example for us. Second is to set up a sustainable and restructure with investment. Given the fact that most private investors do not benefit, it's suggested to improve the quality management of projects and introduce asset management with the purpose of mitigating climate risk and addressing green infrastructure challenges. The third suggestion is that I think we need to change the PPT slide. The third suggestion is that international organizations and development banks could be served as platforms to attract overseas investment and provide political motivation for domestic public investment, actively improve climate risk disclosure into international standards. According to Financing for Sustainable Development Report 2021, their sovereign bond bills had a premium of 275%. Therefore, promoting green and sustainable infrastructure through green finance can make low-cost borrowing and investment stimulus mutually interacting with each other, and then form a virtuous circle which is beneficial to the country's long-term development of green infrastructure. Next page. Next page. Similar to these possibilities to promote green infrastructure in developing countries, current developments happened. For example, according to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals report of 2020, around 20 million people entered extreme poverty in 2020, and the Asian Development Bank estimates that Southeast Asia will require 210 billion per year between 2016 until 2030 to support investment in vital climate resilient infrastructure. Prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, infrastructure investment, particularly from private capital sources, was far below the levels required. Taking into account climate change, the investment gap was estimated between 3.8% and 4.1% of the GDP from 2016 until 2020 in some ASEAN countries. ASEAN Catalytic Green Finance Facility is established as an ASEAN Infrastructure Fund initiative, which supports governments in Southeast Asia to prepare and finance infrastructure projects that promote environmental sustainability and contribute to climate change goal. For Africa, it needs 100 billion per year for the next decade to address energy poverty across the continent. Africa Green Infrastructure Investment Bank announced that it will seek to raise between 3 billion and 5 billion from African institutional investors and governments and mobilize 20 billion for investment partners. Furthermore, the Africa Green Finance Coalition was announced at the UN Climate Change conferences a few days ago to spur the trillions of dollars in green investment needed to transform Africa's economy. It is even pointed out that Africa has a 2.3 trillion investment gap in its core infrastructure, which must be addressed. For China, it announced to achieve carbon neutrality by 2060. It promotes to not build new coal-fired power projects abroad at recent UN General Assembly. Shortly after this, the Bank of China said it would no longer finance new coal mining and power projects abroad for the last quarter of 2021. In this respect, Shi will further analyze China's regulatory attempts in carbon neutrality later for us. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. So next speaker will be Associate Professor Fenghua Li. So he will discuss the innovating the partnership in private sector.
Well, thanks, Chi. Should I wait? Yes, the slides on. Hello, everyone. I'm Fenghua Li from University of International Business and Economics. My topic I will present today is about the Kampala Principles and their implementation. This is the project work based on a project I have done at the German Development Institute. It's about the private sector engagement in development cooperation. My presentation is about how to incentive the private sector to engage in the actions for the UN 2030 agenda. Could you help to turn to the next slide, please? In the first part, I will brief you a little bit about what are the Kampala Principles. If you look at the UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, the goal 13 is about the climate change. It requires us to take urgent actions to combat climate change and its impact. If you look at the current the existing platforms or initiatives that we have, such as the UN Global Compact, we know that the existing platforms and initiatives they have their limitations. However, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development requires more active participations of different private sectors to utilize their innovations and resources to solve the sustainable development challenges. Could you help to turn to the next slide, please? The actions for the UN 2030 agendas needs the role, active role of private sector, and the private sector is not only just a stakeholder. They have to engage more. So considering the limitations of the current platforms and initiative, we believe that more inclusiveness is needed for the existing platforms. So the international societies create a new mechanisms called the Gpedc. The Gpedc not only cover the current activity players for the actions for UN 2030 agenda, including such as like the business, the government, the civil society, and trade unions. It also emphasizes the necessary roles of the private sector. Could you turn to the next slide, please? Now, the Gpedc, we now on this slide, I will review a little bit about the histories of the Gpedc. Because now the current platforms and initiatives they have their limitations. So the Busan Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation, the creators of the Busan Partnerships, they create a new working group, the Business Leader Caucus in 2017, and this group they endorse a new principles called the Kampala Principles in 2019. The name is that the Kampala the full name is Kampala Principles on effective private sector engagement in development cooperation. And the objective of the Kampala Principles is to promote the private sector engagement in the actions for sustainable development. In other words, it is about how to use the innovation and resources, especially the financial resources from the private sectors to solve the sustainable development challenges, including the climate change. Now, could you turn to the next slide, please? Now I will brief you a little bit about the Kampala Principles. The Kampala Principles, they include three specific principles. The first one is inclusive country ownership. It is about the strengthening coordination, alignment, and capacity building at the countryside. It provides better engagement with government and natural stakeholders at the countryside. And the second principle is the result and target impact. The second principle aims to realize sustainable development outcomes through multiple benefits. For the private sector, it provides some business opportunities for the private sector. For example, the private sector can make a profit while doing good for the poor by achieving core business objectives that enhance business reputation and contributes to broader development goals. The third principle is the inclusive partnership. The partnership is inclusive. It is to foster the trust through inclusive dialogues and consultations for businessmen, for the private sectors. It will help the private sector to gain access to unemployed market and consumers, so that they can enhance their growth potential in emerging and hard-to-reach contexts. The fourth principle is about the transparency and accountability. It is to measuring and disseminate the sustainable development results for learning and scale up of success. That means that if we have a successful project, we can use it as an example, as a model, and we can promote it to the other projects that use the Kampala Principles as a tool to achieve the SDGs. The final principle is to leave no one behind. It is like Kampala Principles not only focus on the development of the developing countries, it also covers the needs from the developing country, and so the financial resource will be distributed to the developing countries. And this is the brief presentations of the five Kampala Principles. Could you help to turn to the next slides, please? This is a project I have conducted at the German Development Institutes. When we did the research, we have arranged a number of interviews with the stakeholders who actually promotes the Kampala Principles, who are the creators behind the Gpedc. They are like OECD, UNDP, and the BMC. BMC is the German Federal Ministries of International Economic development and cooperation, and some private sector companies like Biotrans in South Africa. Could you help to turn to the next slide? Thanks. Now we move to the second part. Now you know us now. At this moment, we have already have some platforms or initiatives such as the UN Global Compact and the Green Brown Principles and Social Brown Principles, and we also have the Climate Brown Initiative. So why we still have to create a the new Kampala Principles? We believe that the Kampala Principles are necessary for 3 reasons. The first reason is that the existing platforms or initiative have their inherent limitations. For example, like if we look at the existing platforms or initiatives, normally they focus on the corporate social responsibilities. By comparisons, the Kampala Principles are geared towards supporting national and global sustainable development priorities, including the climate change and of course the 2030 agenda, and the spirit of helping those behind. And the second limitations of the existing platforms on and initiatives is that they normally related to they have the scarcities of donor perspective. By comparisons, the Kampala Principles recognize finance as one of the essential typologies of private sector engagement used by development partners. And the third limitations of the existing platform or initiatives that it usually apply to international enterprises. By comparisons, that the Kampala Principles recognize the diversities of the private sector and aim to engage like small or media enterprises, companies, enterprises. The second one is that the Kampala Principles can provide a new normative guidance for private sector partnerships. And the third one is that the Kampala Principles emphasize the effectiveness of global partnerships. And we just compare the Kampala Principles and the existing platforms or initiative, and we believe that the Kampala Principles are necessary at this moment. Could you help to turn to the next slide, please? Thank you. And now we have the principles themselves, and we are aware of the necessities of the Kampala Principles. But the real problem is about the implementations of the Kampala Principles. How to promote the private sector use the Kampala Principles as a tool to restructure their business structure, or to create their business plans, or to raise the money, in terms of the finance, so as to achieve the SDGs. This is the challenges. We find that the challenges can be divided into two times. The first time is the first time of the challenge is the internal challenges. This is because the Kampala Principles are too broad and general, so it might be a bit difficult to apply the Kampala Principles in practice. And there are some concepts in the Kampala Principles are quite ambiguous. It also the ambiguities also generates challenges for the effectiveness implementation of the Kampala Principle. Currently, there is no practical monitoring of the projects use the Kampala Principles and no sanction mechanisms. But when we mention the sanction mechanism, it's also a bit controversial because the Kampala Principles in nature, they are voluntary. So it is the private sector, voluntarily use the Kampala Principles as a tool to operate their business. So if the Kampala Principles are voluntary in nature, how can it why the violations of the Kampala Principles will give right to the ascension? And this is the internal challenges. And the second type of the challenges is the external challenges. First, there is the lack of awareness of the Kampala Principles. At this moment, since the launch of the Kampala Principles in 2019, many people are not aware of the Kampala Principles. They don't know the Kampala Principles. How can they use the Kampala Principles? And second, there is no functional platforms for dialogues among different stakeholders. I mean, the COP section is a good platforms for different stakeholders to discuss the climate change, to address the difficulties faced by the current faced by the current societies. But for the implementations of the Kampala Principles, there is no functional platforms. There is no like a permanent platform or initiative. The third, there is a significant lack of trust among different stakeholders. The engagements of the private sector in some cases may also give rise to some tensions between governments and between the private sectors. So the implementation of the Kampala Principles also face some significant challenges. Could you help to continue? Thank you. We also realizing the different challenges in terms of the implementations of the Kampala Principles. We also figure out some potential solutions to address the challenges. The first one is the awareness. That means that the Gpedc should raise the awareness of the Kampala Principles to the public. They should translate the regulatory or legal context to business languages to make the subjects more attractive to private sectors. And they also have to, like to make the benefits visible for the private sectors. They have to present the short-term and long-term benefits. If private sectors would like to use the Kampala Principles. And for the internal challenges, the Gpedc should define some concepts in their own principles. For example, they have to define the concepts like success, some key terms in the Kampala Principles, like the effectiveness. Because if we don't know how to measure the success, how could we know that we use how could the private sector use the Kampala principles, and they know that their projects is successful. And this is my whole presentation. In brief, it's about the finance. It's about the finance. How to promote the private sector use new principles as a tool to make more contribution to the SDGs, including the climate change. And this is my presentation. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Fenghua Li. All right. Sorry for this. Okay, so next speaker will be Dr. Meihui Zhang. So she will discuss about the greening economy and the sustainable enterprise by green finance.
Thank you, Julia, and thank you for the invitation from Dr. Chi Zhang. Today, the title of my presentation will be Greening the Economy by Financing Sustainable Enterprises, and I would like to update several regulatory developments in China with all of you. Please, next page. Well, this is the basic outline of my presentation, so I will start from the first question. What are the major ways to finance sustainable projects or sustainable enterprises in China? As we have already learned about from Dr. Ziyu Liu, the 30-60 target announced by President Xi Jinping has been announced for a while, and China is on its way to promote greening its economy. However, there are several problems, or there are several issues on this topic. And first, the greening economies, the green economies are in high demand for financial resources. However, commercial banks are not very motivated to support the green project and green enterprises. The major reason is that, well, for the commercial banks, they will find that the green projects are usually medium to long term and making the projects less appealing to commercial banks. And for the second reason why commercial banks would not like to offer bank loans to the green projects, some borrowers do not have sufficient collaterals to secure the loan. Well, there is another sources for the green finance, and it is the ESG investment. ESG investment, we would like to talk about green bonds and the investing in listed company stocks. However, the major challenge or obstacles for ESG investors in investing in green bonds or investing in listed companies in China has several aspects. First, there is information asymmetry between the securities issuer and between outside investors, because the investors do not know what is happening inside the enterprise and whether the project is really green, and that would lead to the greenwashing issues. Second, the profitability of the green projects is also sometimes suspicious. And third, there is regulatory uncertainty in China in the past several years. However, in order to promote the green finance, the financial regulators in China has announced several, in fact, many regulatory methods and legislations in order to promote the green finance. Please turn to next page. For ESG investors, well, we would like to discuss about how could financial regulation to take its role to enhance green finance. First, China has updated its rule about the ESG disclosure for listed companies. For example, in this year, 2021, the Chinese Security Regulation Commission has updated its guidelines on the form of annual and half-yearly reports of listed companies, and it required that listed companies in China which are key emission unit, must disclose major environmental information to all of its investors and report that information to the regulator. And for other listed companies, they would also be required to disclose their environmental penalties for their pollutions to the environment. And all of the listed companies in China now are encouraged to voluntarily disclose their conducts in protecting the environment and in preventing or controlling pollution and fulfilling the environmental responsibilities, as well as the measures they have been taking to reduce carbon emissions. And as for the security exchanges, the Shenzhen Security Exchanges and Shanghai Security Exchange has also taken measures to promoting ESG disclosure for the listed company listed in the exchange. For example, Shenzhen Stock Exchange has announced a guideline for the listed companies that all of the Shenzhen listed companies are mandatorily required to disclose key indicators for energy conservation and emission reduction, and they would also be required to disclose how the environmental law and regulations have impacted the company's business in their annual report. And the annual report must be disclosed to all of the investors and report to the financial regulator. And next, when we talk about the green bonds, China has updated its green bond standards in this year and updated the catalog for the what kind of projects are the right projects that could issue green bonds. And the new catalog announced in 2021 is applied to all green bonds, and it has added some new categories and subcategories so that more green sectors could be included in the catalog, and the enterprise or the corporation could issue green bonds in the public market. And third, we must talk about the rules against the greenwashing in green bond sector, because green bond issuer would like to make sure that the investments are used in true green projects. And China has announced a draft information disclosure indicators of green bonds for environmental impact, and as well as set up a rule for external certification of green bonds to make sure the project financed by green bonds are really green. And for the commercial banks as creditors in the banking market, and for the financial intermediaries who play the role as underwriters in the security issue market, China regulators have announced several policy motivations. For example, in this year, the the China Banking and Insurance Regulatory Commission has announced the Green Finance Evaluation Program for banking institutions and set up an indicator system for all of the commercial banks. And the commercial banks are required to take part in green finance, for example, issuing green finance bonds or apply green bank loans to the enterprises, and all of the banks will be rated by the evaluation result, and they would be published, or if they have failed to fulfill the program. And next, we are talking about China's green financing regulatory regulations. China is recently taken forward-looking measures to accelerate the growth of green finance sector to fulfill the 30-60 target, and they are regulatory reform continues to be undertaken. And one example is that China's central bank, PBOC, recently has announced that it would encourage commercial banks to accept carbon quotas as loan collateral. However, there are some difficulties in this issue because commercial banks might feel doubtful or suspicious for their writers as creditors if they accept the carbon quotas as the collateral, and whether the banks could resell carbon quotas in the market as easily as other tangible collateral, such as the real estate, in the case of default. And that is the problem that must be solved if China wishes to develop its carbon emission market. And the market will also need more trading participants to become an effective secondary market. And this is my presentation about China's recent regulatory develops about green finance. Thank you, Julia. Please turn to Dr. Chi Zhang.
Mei Hui. So in the final speech, I will deliver the speech around the legal foundation for the carbon finance in developing countries. I will use China as a case study to illustrate what kind of necessary legal regimes should be established for promoting carbon finance market. Next one, please. Thank you. Yeah, the outline of my speech. So firstly, I would like to mention a little bit about the challenges in the traditional financial regulation and its relevance with the carbon finance market. Then I would like to discuss a little bit about the institutional structure and the economic function of carbon markets and what kind of particularity which is different from the traditional financial markets. Then I would like use the Chinese development of the carbon finance market to illustrate what are the steps that most of the developing countries may have to experience to establish its legal infrastructure of the carbon finance market. Okay, next one. Thank you. Yeah, so firstly, the carbon finance as a kind of incentive mechanism. So as we know that, as Mei Hui Zhang just correctly mentioned, so from the traditional perspective, the regulator and the government tend to impose a series of restrictions on the enterprises and the private sectors. Say you have to do something beneficial to the environment, or you have to restrict your, for example, the carbon dioxide emission, because we need to protect the environment. But actually, it is not really economically beneficial to the enterprises, even it is a kind of transaction cost for the enterprises. But what is the advantage of carbon finance markets? Because carbon finance actually play a role as an incentive mechanism instead of only the restrictions imposed by the regulators, right? And then, for example, here we can see the carbon asset can be efficiently used by the enterprises to make money instead of only to impose the transaction cost, increasing transaction costs. So this is why actually more and more enterprises have the motivation to participate in the global carbon finance market. So next one, please. Oh, thank you. So generally speaking, we can analyze the carbon finance market in three aspects. So firstly is the carbon trading market. So carbon trading markets, generally speaking, we divide, for example, the quota that are allocated by the government to those high emission, high carbon dioxide emission enterprises freely. Yeah, so in other words, the enterprises, you can freely use that quotas to emit the carbon dioxide without the payments. So if you just enter such threshold, and particularly if the enterprise, you improve your technology, improve your clean production technologies in a given period of time. For example, you can particularly dramatically reduce your carbon dioxide emission. Then the quota allocated to you, you can sell out. You can sell out them to other enterprises in the market. So in such a way, actually, the carbon asset can be another way to expand your financing activities. So this is actually a kind of motivation. So this is also why currently we particularly highlight the importance of carbon finance. Yeah, so we can combine the ESG investment, green finance, green loan, and the carbon finance market together. So because they play different roles in different aspects in ESG and sustainable finance market. Then we have to look at the legal foundation of carbon finance. So in other words, if we decide to establish a well-sound carbon finance market, what kind of legal necessities we have to establish? We have to make sure that the following legal matters will run correctly and efficiently. Firstly, I think private law should play a very fundamental and underlying role in this area. So for example, at least we in our private law, for example, in the civil law tradition countries, some of them promulgated their civil code, for example, they need to make recognition of the legal status of carbon asset, for example, the carbon dioxide emission right. So such kind of what's the legal nature of such kind of right? Because it's actually a kind of financial and institutional innovation. So previously we don't have such kind of private right, but actually we need to recognize it in the most fundamental way. So this is the first step. The second step is, as I just mentioned, the carbon dioxide emission right can be traded in the market. So in other words, we need to clarify the transferability and the possibility to use those carbon dioxide to use it as a kind of pledge, as a kind of a right in to use the carbon emission right to expand its finance activities to secure their economic transactions. So pledge and guarantee institution is very important. Then thirdly, in most countries, particularly the developed countries, we establish like the law on futures and options. They are also relevant with the carbon finance market. So because we need to establish some legal institution to hedge the risk in carbon finance, which is quite similar like in the capital markets and securities markets. And finally is the regulations, because actually the carbon dioxide emission rights can be traded, which is a little bit similar like a kind of security. It's like a kind of a transferable security in the market. So the clear and uniform regulatory arrangement is very necessary, it's very essential. Yeah, so it will ensure that the regulation of the carbon finance market to be efficient. The next one, please. So in the second part of my speech, I would like to use China as a case study, as an example to show, for example, if in developing countries, so because in the developing countries, maybe the legal foundation to some extent is a little bit weak. So because they need more time to establish their comprehensive and the well-sound the underlying legal foundation. So for example, in China, as early as 2008, Chinese government tend to establish some environmental exchanges and permit the trade of like the CDM projects, and tends to make some pilot programs, say whether the carbon dioxide emission right can be traded. So there's a kind of experimental pilot program in China. Then in 2012, the NDRC, the National Development and Reform Commission of China, announced a series of pilot carbon emission trading schemes in those leading cities in China, like Beijing, Tianjin, even in some provinces like Hubei province. So as early as 2012, so in China, we have established some local market to trade carbon asset. So next one, please. Okay, thank you. Then A milestone for carbon finance development in China, I think, should be the promulgation of the civil code in 2020, which come into force in this year. So according to the Article 440, for example, of the civil code of the PRC, it has officially recognized a very flexible and wide range of rights which can be used as a pledge in commercial transactions. For example, here, the seventh subsection under Article 440 say other property rights that may be pledged in accordance with laws and administrative regulations can be used as pledge to secure the commercial transactions. So here we can see in developing countries, maybe we need to take more time to make sure that our property rights system can be more inclusive, can recognize more flexible kinds of or other kinds of private rights as a kind of underlying private rights. So previously, because it's more conservative, we only focus on like the real estate, movable or unmovable property rights or something like that. But currently, we need to expand the scope of the private rights. Okay, thanks. Then the third stage, I would like to say, for example, in China, we need to combine and unify the carbon trading markets at a national level. So as I just mentioned previously, we established a series of trading schemes at the local level, only at the leading cities or some given province to make some pilot programs. But after around 10 years experiment, China's government decided to unify their carbon trading market at the national level. So the national carbon market was established in this year in July. So this is another big step that we take towards the carbon finance era in China. And at the same time, Chinese government also promulgated the specific regulation which is applicable to the carbon trading activities throughout the whole country. So previously, we just permit, for example, each the carbon trading market, carbon trading local market to establish its own pilot regulatory arrangement. But currently, we established the uniformed regulatory system, and the exclusive regulator would be the Ministry of Ecology and Environment of the PRC. So this is also another step of development and progress. Thank you. Yeah, so according to the new regulation promulgated this year, the regulatory arrangements of carbon finance market in China has been particularly developed and improved. For example, the quota allocation mode is the national and the local level. The emission quota is allocated by the Ministry of Ecology and Environment of the PRC, and the provincial quotas are determined by the competent department of the Ecology and Environment Protection. So here we can see at both the local and the national level in China, for example, now it is the time to make clear what the exact rule they should comply with. Yeah. So the next one, please. Thanks. Then the fourth step, I think, is around the financial derivatives regulations, because we know, for example, in EU markets, we have established quite well sound and comprehensive financial regulatory system of futures and derivatives. Similarly, the carbon trading rights or carbon trading unit is we can call the quasi securities in financial market. It can be freely traded. It can be we have the price mechanism, right, to marketize the carbon trading. So the future law, for example, the futures law of the PRC currently is being enacted, and we expect it can be propagated in the following year, for example. So this is also regarded as another very essential progress in carbon finance regulation. So because if we establish a kind of financial market like which perform like some similar functions, securities market, we need some legal arrangements to hedge the risk for investors. Because if we don't have the legal mechanism to hedge the risk for investors, the high risk will be a kind of deterrence. So we need to encourage more investors to engage in this market. So risk hedging mechanism is another very necessary legal foundation for carbon market. So because one of the nature of carbon market, carbon finance will quite similar to securities market. Yeah, if we want to make the carbon trading unit and right to be more transferable. Yeah. So finally, based on my observation of Chinese carbon finance market development, I would like to summarize the following 4 points as implications for developing countries. The firstly, the transferability of carbon emission rights is a kind of a quasi securities, which we require some similar regulatory approaches and strategies as we have done in securities market. Secondly, we need to particularly emphasize the inclusive scope of proprietary right in private law. And this is also particularly relevant to like the financial derivatives. So for example, all the financial derivatives like options and futures, we require the collateral, right? We require collateral. But what kind of a right can be used to secure the transaction to be used as a kind of collateral? So currently, for example, we encourage the upcoming, for example, the future law of China to include those non-cash collateral. So if we include the non-cash collateral, the carbon trading rights can be used as kind of a pledge. So it also can encourage the development of carbon finance, and we can motivate more investors to participate in the financial aspect, financial markets in carbon markets. And thirdly, finally, the regulation is another important aspect in carbon finance markets, because we need to make sure that the rules, the standards, and particularly the quotation system to allocate those carbon trading units to all the relevant enterprises. We need to make sure that all the market entry standard is equally applied to those enterprises in all the areas. So the unified and clear regulator and regulatory approach is also very essential for developing countries to establish its carbon finance market. So overall, in my opinion, I believe that the carbon finance market should be favored by more and more developing countries, particularly during the COVID-19 eras, because actually more and more those high carbon dioxide emission enterprises, they need to expand its financing tools, particularly in the current difficult time. But if we permit them to use the carbon trading rights more flexibly, they will have more motivation and incentives to participate in the carbon finance market. Okay, so that's my speech. Thank you very much. Okay, so now I would like to welcome any questions or yeah, please.
Sir, you told about national carbon market at China, and like it's a big development, and many congratulations on that. So I want to ask the national carbon market that is recently formed, how uniform it is with respect to the private and the public law and the property laws of China. Two, if there is any kind of ambiguity with respect to law, or what is the jurisdiction of the court, will it be same with respect to the other trading market, or will it be having a special jurisdiction over the courts?
Okay, thank you for the question. So in my opinion, actually, I think so first I just use China as an example. And currently China established its the underlying private law system by its the civil code. So in terms of the carbon trading rights, I would like to say, actually firstly, we need to make sure that the carbon trading right, it can be generally recognized a kind of private right. So, but particularly, for example, in some other developing countries, I'm not absolutely sure, but actually, I think in some developing countries, they need to clarify what kind of private right can be used as security right. So in some countries, civil code only listed several kinds of private rights, for example, securities, equity, even like the transferable commercial papers or something like that. But we need to give more leeway, give more room to adopt the innovative rights, because sometimes, for example, if we decide to establish a carbon market in other developing countries, but currently it is quite costly to change its underlying private law system. So in my opinion, I think a more efficient way to do that is we need to adopt some general rules to make sure that if we need to innovate new kinds of property rights, then we can do that. Yeah.
I'm really sorry, but the next panel starts in 2 minutes.
In 2 minutes. Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
get to the next scene.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much for all the attendees. Thank you very much. And thank you for all the speakers to attend our today's